On Christmas Eve, my parents announced they were moving in with me. They stood in my living room, suitcases already packed in their car, talking about it like the decision had been made months ago. My mother gestured at my spare bedroom like she was picking out curtains. My father was already measuring the garage for his woodworking equipment. They had keys to my house, keys I'd given them years ago for emergencies, and they'd let themselves in while I was at the grocery store buying ingredients for a quiet holiday dinner for two. Before we go any further into how I got here, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I listened to their plans for exactly 7 minutes before I excused myself, drove to the hardware store, and bought an entire new lock set. By midnight, while they argued with me through my front door, every lock in my house had been changed. My name is Jessica Morgan, and at 32, I finally learned that love doesn't mean access, and family doesn't mean ownership. That night, standing in my kitchen with my boyfriend Ethan helping me install the final deadbolt on the back door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years around my parents. Peace. The kind of bone-deep calm that comes from finally, decisively, choosing yourself. My phone buzzed continuously with increasingly frantic texts from my mother. This is ridiculous. We're your parents. You can't lock us out. We raised you. But that was exactly the problem. They had raised me, and they'd never stopped. Even now, with my own mortgage and my own business and my own life carefully constructed from the ground up, they still saw me as an extension of themselves. A project that needed constant management and correction. The spare bedroom they'd claimed so confidently was actually my home office, the place where I ran my graphic design studio, where client presentations lived on my walls and my creative work happened in the quiet hours before dawn. The garage they wanted to fill with my father's table saw and lumber was where I kept my vintage motorcycle, the one I'd restored myself over 2 years, the one my mother called my midlife crisis even though I was nowhere near midlife. Every space in my small bungalow had a purpose, a story, a reason for existing exactly as it was. And none of those reasons included becoming a retirement home for two people who had a perfectly good house of their own. The evening had started innocently enough. I'd spent the morning at my studio downtown, finishing up a logo redesign for a local brewery that wanted to launch their new spring line. My business partner Lauren had already left for her family's cabin up north, and the streets of Minneapolis were quieter than usual, that peculiar hush that falls over cities on Christmas Eve when everyone retreats into their private celebrations. I'd stopped at the Copper Hen for my usual oat milk latte, chatted with Mia about her new interior design project, and felt genuinely content with my plans. A simple dinner with Ethan, maybe a movie, definitely avoiding the chaos of my parents' annual Christmas Eve extravaganza where my mother orchestrated everything down to the timing of gift opening and my father played genial host while secretly wishing everyone would leave so he could watch basketball in peace. I declined their invitation weeks ago. A decision that had required 3 phone calls and 1 tense lunch meeting where my mother suggested I was being selfish and my father looked disappointed in that specific way he perfected over the years, where he never said anything but his silence communicated volumes. They wanted me there because my younger brother Tyler was bringing his new fiancée, and apparently my presence was required to make it a complete family tableau. Never mind that I'd spent the last 5 Christmas Eves doing exactly what they wanted, sitting through elaborate dinners and forced game nights and my mother's passive-aggressive comments about my life choices, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. This year, I'd chosen differently. Ethan and I had been together for 8 months, long enough to know this was something real, something worth protecting. He understood boundaries in a way my family never had. When I told him I needed to skip the big family gathering, he didn't push or question or suggest I was being difficult. He just asked what I wanted to do instead, and when I said I wanted to cook something simple and watch old movies in my pajamas, he said that sounded perfect. No judgment, no agenda, just acceptance of me as I was. So when I walked into my house at 4 in the afternoon, arms full of grocery bags containing ingredients for homemade lasagna and the makings of a decent tiramisu, the last thing I expected was to find my parents in my living room. My mother was standing at my bookshelf, rearranging my carefully curated collection of design books and novels, tutoring about my organizational system. My father was in my kitchen, opening cabinets and examining my pantry contents with the air of someone conducting an inspection. And their suitcases, large rolling cases that suggested extended stays rather than overnight visits, sat lined up by my front door like soldiers awaiting orders. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood something, forgotten some plan we'd made. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. Because when my mother turned and saw me, her face broke into that bright, determined smile that I'd learned over 32 years meant she was about to steamroll over any objection I might raise. "Surprise," she said, though nothing about this felt like a surprise and everything about it felt like an ambush. "We've decided to spend the holidays with you instead. Isn't this better than you being alone?" I wasn't alone. Ethan was coming over in 2 hours. But before I could say that, my father emerged from the kitchen and started explaining, in that reasonable tone he used when he'd already made up his mind about something, that they'd thought about it and realized how sad it must be for me to spend Christmas by myself in this little house, and wouldn't it be nicer to have family around, and they'd just stay through New Year's, maybe a bit longer. Really, they'd been meaning to talk to me about their concerns about the house anyway. It was too big for them now, too much maintenance, and my spare room would be perfect for them while they figured out their next steps. The spare room. My office. The place where I earned my living, where I met with clients over video calls, where I'd finally created a professional space that reflected the business I'd built from nothing. They wanted to turn it into their bedroom while they figured out their next steps, a phrase so vague it could mean anything from a few weeks to forever. And they were talking about it like I'd already agreed, like my opinion on the matter of who lived in my house was merely a formality to be addressed after the fact. I set the grocery bags down carefully on the counter, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. The same feeling I used to get as a teenager when my mother would go through my room and throw away things she didn't think I needed, or when my father would volunteer me for activities I'd never expressed interest in, or when both of them would make decisions about my life and inform me afterward, always with that same breezy confidence that they knew what was best. I'd spent my entire 20s learning to recognize that feeling, and my early 30s learning to trust it. It was the feeling of my boundaries being violated, of my autonomy being dismissed, of people who claimed to love me treating me like property they had the right to manage. "How did you get in?" I asked quietly. My mother laughed, that tinkling sound she made when she thought something was silly. "We have keys, Jessica. You gave them to us for emergencies. This isn't an emergency. We wanted to surprise you. That's what families do. They surprise each other." She was already moving toward my spare room, throwing the door open to survey the space. "We'll need to move your desk, obviously. And these shelves can go in the basement. Do you even use half this stuff?" "This is my office," I said, following her. "I work here. This is where I run my business." "You can work from the coffee shop," she replied, waving her hand dismissively. "Or that studio downtown you're always at. This is wasted space, honey. A whole room just for you to sit at a computer. Besides, we'll be quiet. You won't even know we're here." But I would know. I would know every single second, just like I'd known for the first 24 years of my life when I'd lived under their roof and their rules and their constant surveillance masquerading as concern. I would know when I woke up and when I went to sleep and every moment in between, because they would be there, in my space, reshaping it to fit their needs without ever asking if their needs aligned with mine. My father joined us, already talking about bathroom schedules and whether I had enough hot water for 3 people showering in the mornings, and how he'd need to bring his CPAP machine over tomorrow, and did I have any plans for New Year's because the Hendersons were having a party and we should all go as a family. Not asking. Informing. The way they'd always done, the way I'd finally, painfully, learned to recognize and reject. Except I'd never rejected it this definitively before. I'd never had to, because I'd never had something this completely mine to protect. "I need you both to leave," I said. The words came out steady, which surprised me. My mother stopped mid-sentence about curtains. "What?" "I need you to leave. Now. Take your suitcases and go home." "We are home," my mother said, and something in her voice had gone sharp. "We're staying with you. This is happening, Jessica. We've already canceled our plans." "No," I said. "This isn't happening. You don't get to move into my house without asking me. We're your parents, my father said, and he sounded genuinely confused, like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. Since when do we need permission? Since always, I wanted to say. Since the moment I bought this house with my own money and my own mortgage and my own vision for what my life should look like. Since the moment I became an adult with the right to decide who entered my space and my life. Since birth, actually, since every human being deserved bodily autonomy and the right to their own boundaries, but I'd never been taught that growing up. I'd been taught that family meant access, that love meant surrender, that being a good daughter meant being endlessly available and infinitely flexible to their needs and wants and whims. The argument that followed was circular and exhausting. My mother cried. My father got stern. They tag-teamed me with guilt and obligation and reminders of everything they'd done for me, as if raising a child they'd chosen to have was some kind of debt I could never repay. They called me selfish and ungrateful and cold. They said Ethan must be influencing me, turning me against them, because the Jessica they knew would never treat her parents this way. And maybe they were right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maybe the Jessica they knew wouldn't have. But that Jessica had slowly disappeared over the years, replaced by someone who'd learned through therapy and hard experience that she had the right to exist on her own terms. I grew up in Edina, in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful suburban living. My parents bought their colonial when I was 2, back when my father's accounting firm was taking off and my mother had just quit her job as a bank teller to focus on raising me and eventually my brother Tyler. From the outside, we looked like the ideal American family. Inside, we were a carefully managed performance where every deviation from the script was gently but firmly corrected. My mother ran our household the way a CEO runs a corporation, with schedules and systems and an unwavering belief that she knew the optimal way to do everything. My father supported her methods with his silence, occasionally intervening when things got too heated but mostly letting her orchestrate our lives while he focused on work. They weren't cruel parents. They never hit us or screamed or did any of the obvious terrible things that would have made it easy to identify the problem. Instead, they smothered us with a specific kind of love that required we become exactly who they needed us to be. My bedroom growing up was decorated in soft pastels my mother chose, filled with furniture she selected, arranged in a configuration she decided was most efficient. When I was 13 and wanted to paint my walls black, she laughed and said that was a phase and we'd revisit it when I was thinking more clearly. We never revisited it. When I was 15 and wanted to try out for the basketball team, my father suggested I focus on academic clubs instead because athletics weren't really my strength, never mind that he'd never seen me play and had no idea what my strengths might be. When I was 17 and got accepted to an art school in Chicago, my mother sat me down and explained, very reasonably, why that would be a waste of my potential and how a business degree from the University of Minnesota would open so many more doors. I went to the University of Minnesota. I majored in business marketing because it was close enough to creative work that I could convince myself I was still pursuing something I cared about. I lived at home for the first 2 years because my parents insisted it made financial sense, which it did, except the cost wasn't measured in money but in autonomy. Every decision I made was subject to their input, their approval, their gentle steering toward whatever they thought was best. Who I dated, where I worked, how I spent my free time, all of it required navigating their opinions and managing their feelings about my choices. The breaking point came when I was 24. I'd been dating someone my mother didn't approve of, a musician named Chris who worked at a recording studio and had tattoos and dreams that didn't include a 9-to-5 job. He wasn't a bad person. He was kind and creative and he saw me as someone capable of making my own decisions, which was revolutionary after a lifetime of being managed. My mother hated him on sight. Too unfocused, she said. No ambition. Not the kind of man who builds a stable life. My father agreed, though more quietly. They didn't forbid me from seeing him because I was an adult, but they made it clear through 1,000 small comments and pointed silences that they expected me to come to my senses. When Chris and I got serious enough to talk about moving in together, I made the mistake of mentioning it at Sunday dinner. The explosion was immediate. My mother actually stood up from the table, hand pressed to her chest like I'd announced I was joining a cult. My father's jaw tightened in that way that meant he was deeply disappointed but trying to stay calm. They spent the next 2 hours explaining why this was a mistake, why I was too young, why Chris wasn't right for me, why I needed to think about my future and my reputation and what people would think. The word no never actually came up. They didn't say I couldn't do it. They just made it abundantly clear that doing it would hurt them, disappoint them, fundamentally alter their view of me as their responsible daughter. And because I'd been trained my entire life to prioritize their feelings over my own instincts, I didn't move in with Chris. I broke up with him instead, citing all the reasonable concerns they'd planted in my head. He was confused and hurt, and I was miserable, but my parents were relieved and proud of me for making the mature choice. That was the word my mother used. Mature. As if maturity meant abandoning what I wanted in favor of what made them comfortable. Chris moved to Nashville 6 months later. I saw on social media that he'd started his own production company and seemed happy. Meanwhile, I was still living at home, still working at a marketing firm I didn't love, still making choices based on what my parents thought was best. I was suffocating slowly, so gradually that I didn't realize I couldn't breathe until one day I was sitting in traffic on my way home from work and I started crying for no reason I could name. Just tears streaming down my face, my chest tight, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and uncertain. That night, I called Mia. We'd been friends since college, and she was the only person in my life who'd ever directly challenged my parents' influence. She picked up on the second ring, listened to me try to explain what was wrong and fail because I didn't have words for it, and then said something that changed everything. Jess, you know you're allowed to want things, right? You're allowed to make choices that are yours, even if they disappoint other people. Even if those people are your parents. The concept was so foreign that I actually laughed, a bitter sound that surprised me. My therapist, Dr. Stevens, whom I started seeing 2 weeks after that phone call, would later explain that I'd been raised in what she called an enmeshed family system. Boundaries weren't clear. My parents' needs and my needs were treated as interchangeable. Love was conditional on compliance. Disagreement was viewed as betrayal. I'd never learned that I was a separate person from them with the right to a separate life because everything in my upbringing had taught me the opposite. Therapy was brutal. Not because Dr. Stevens was harsh but because seeing the patterns clearly meant acknowledging how deeply they'd shaped me. Every session revealed another way I'd contorted myself to fit their expectations. The career I'd chosen to please my father. The relationships I'd sabotaged to appease my mother. The dreams I'd dismissed because they didn't align with their vision of success. I was 25 years old and I'd never made a single major life decision based purely on what I wanted. I didn't even know what I wanted because I'd never been allowed to develop wants that diverged from theirs. Moving out was the first real boundary I set. I was 26, had saved enough for a down payment, and found a tiny condo in Longfellow that needed work but was mine. My parents responded exactly as Dr. Stevens had predicted they would. They didn't forbid it, but they questioned everything. Was I sure I could afford it? Wouldn't it be smarter to keep saving? What about the neighborhood? Had I really thought this through? My mother cried and said she'd always imagined I'd live at home until I got married, that this felt like I was pushing them away. My father offered to loan me money with strings attached, suggesting we draw up a contract that would give them input on major decisions since they'd be invested. I moved out anyway, declining their money and their opinions. The first night in my condo, sleeping on an air mattress because my furniture hadn't arrived yet, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Fear, yes, because I was truly on my own for the first time. But also exhilaration. The space was mine. Nobody was going to walk in and rearrange my things or comment on my choices or expect me to justify my decisions. For the first time in my life, I could breathe all the way in. The next few years were a process of slowly learning who I was when I wasn't performing for an audience of 2. I quit the marketing firm and started freelancing, building a client base through work I actually cared about. I bought the vintage motorcycle my mother called impractical and my father called dangerous, and I learned to ride it anyway. I dated people my parents would have vetoed and discovered what I actually valued in a relationship. I made mistakes, learned from them, made different mistakes. It wasn't always pretty or comfortable, but it was mine. When I was 29, I sold the condo and bought the bungalow. It was a foreclosure that needed everything, from updated electrical to a new roof, but I saw potential where everyone else saw problems. My parents toured it once, their faces tight with concern they tried to disguise as interest. My mother pointed out every flaw. My father calculated the renovation costs and suggested I was in over my head. They weren't wrong about the work required, but they were wrong about me. I spent the next year learning basic construction, hiring contractors for what I couldn't do myself, and slowly transforming that house into exactly what I'd envisioned. The spare bedroom became my office after I partnered with Lauren to formalize our design studio. The garage became both workspace and storage for the motorcycle. The backyard became a garden where I grew tomatoes and herbs, something my mother had always said was too much work for too little reward. Every room reflected choices I'd made, colors I'd chosen, a life I'd built. And for 3 years, I'd maintained careful boundaries with my parents. Weekly dinners at their house where I smiled and deflected and shared surface-level updates about my life. Holiday visits that I controlled the timing of. Keys I'd given them for genuine emergencies, like when I went on a 2-week trip to Seattle and needed someone to water my plants. They'd used those keys exactly twice in 3 years, both times with advance notice. Once when I was out of town and a pipe burst. Once when they were in my neighborhood and wanted to drop off some furniture they thought I could use. I'd been clear each time that the keys were for emergencies only, that I expected them to call before coming over, that my home was my private space. They nodded and agreed, and I'd believed we had an understanding. But understanding requires mutual respect for boundaries, and somewhere in the months leading up to that Christmas Eve, my parents had decided those boundaries no longer applied. Tyler had moved to Denver 2 years earlier, establishing a life far enough away that their daily management was impossible. He called once a week, visited twice a year, and had successfully created the kind of relationship with them that I was still struggling to achieve. Close but not enmeshed. Loving but not consumed. He'd told me once that distance was the only thing that made it possible, that physical space created natural boundaries that he didn't have to actively defend. I'd been trying to create those same boundaries while living 20 minutes away, and it was exponentially harder because proximity meant constant opportunity for them to intrude. When Tyler got engaged to Sarah, a pediatric nurse he'd met through friends, my parents redirected all their parenting energy onto me. Their youngest son was settled, successful, building the conventional life they valued. Their daughter was 32, unmarried, running a business they didn't quite understand out of a house they thought was beneath me. I became the problem that needed solving, the project that required intervention. The phone calls increased. The surprise visits to my studio became more frequent. My mother started forwarding me real estate listings for condos in Edina, suggesting I sell the bungalow and move closer to them. My father casually mentioned job openings at firms where I could have a real career with benefits and stability. I deflected and redirected and held my ground, but it was exhausting. Every conversation became a negotiation. Every boundary I set was met with hurt feelings and guilt trips. They weren't respecting my no, they were just waiting for me to change it to yes. And now, on Christmas Eve, they decided to skip the negotiation entirely and simply move themselves into my life whether I consented or not. Standing in my spare bedroom while they discussed their plans for my space, I realized this was the inevitable culmination of 32 years of them believing they had the right to override my wishes. They'd always done it. I just never had something worth protecting enough to finally, definitively, say no. The argument went in circles for what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes. My parents had perfected the art of the circular argument over decades, returning to the same points again and again until you were so exhausted you gave in just to make it stop. They were my parents. They'd sacrificed so much for me. This was what families did for each other. Didn't I love them? Didn't I care about their needs? They were getting older. They needed support. I was being selfish and unreasonable, and this wasn't how they'd raised me to treat people who loved me. I stood in my living room, keys in my hand because I'd never actually made it past setting down the groceries, and felt something shift inside me. A clarity that cut through years of conditioning and guilt. They were right that they'd raised me, but they'd raised me to be endlessly available to them, to prioritize their comfort over my own well-being, to believe that setting boundaries was the same as withdrawing love. And I was done. I was completely, irrevocably done. I need you to leave now, I said again, and this time my voice didn't shake. I'm not discussing this anymore. Take your suitcases and go home. My mother's tears stopped abruptly, replaced by something harder. If we leave now, she said carefully, you're going to regret this. This will damage our relationship permanently. Then that's my choice to make, I replied. But you don't get to move into my house without my permission. You don't get to take over my space and my life and expect me to just accept it because you've decided it's happening. My father tried a different approach, the reasonable one he used in business negotiations. Let's all calm down and talk about this rationally. We don't have to make any decisions tonight. We'll stay at a hotel, come back tomorrow when everyone's had time to think. And then we can discuss this like adults. We're not discussing it tomorrow or any other day, I said. This isn't a negotiation. You don't live here. You're not moving in. That's final. Jessica Elizabeth Morgan, my mother said, using my full name like I was a child being scolded. We are trying to be part of your life. We're trying to help you. You live in this house all alone, working all hours, barely dating anyone seriously. Do you want to end up by yourself? Is that really what you want? I'm not alone, I said quietly. I have friends. I have a boyfriend. I have a life that I've built and that I like. Just because it doesn't look like what you think it should doesn't mean it's wrong or empty or in need of your rescue. Who's this boyfriend? My father asked, latching onto that detail. You haven't mentioned anyone. His name is Ethan, I said. He's an architect. We've been together for 8 months. And he's coming over in an hour, so I really need you both to leave. 8 months and you haven't introduced us? My mother's voice climbed an octave. What are you hiding? Why are you keeping him a secret? Because of this, I gestured at them, at the suitcases, at the entire situation. Because every time I let you into my life, you take over. You don't respect my boundaries. You don't listen when I say no. You make everything about what you need and what you want, and I'm exhausted from trying to have any relationship with you at all. My mother actually gasped, hand to her throat in that theatrical way she had when she wanted to communicate deep hurt. How can you say that? After everything we've done for you, all the opportunities we've given you, this is how you talk to us? The opportunities you forced on me, I corrected. The life you tried to make me live instead of the one I wanted. I'm grateful you raised me, but that doesn't mean I owe you ownership of my adulthood. The conversation deteriorated from there. My mother cried real tears this time, not the strategic ones she used for manipulation. My father got quiet and stern, telling me I was being disrespectful and hurtful and that I clearly needed time to think about what I was saying. They gathered their suitcases with wounded dignity, my mother pausing at the door to deliver one final blow. When you realize how wrong you are about this, when you're ready to apologize, we'll talk. But Jessica, this is going to take a long time to forgive. You've really hurt us tonight. The fact that I was hurt didn't seem to factor into their calculations at all. They left, finally, and I stood in my living room surrounded by grocery bags I'd forgotten about, my hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt like grief. I'd done it. I'd actually stood my ground and made them leave. But the cost was visible in the texts already coming through on my phone. From my mother, paragraphs about disappointment and heartbreak. From my father, shorter messages about respect and family values. From Tyler, who they'd apparently already called, asking what the hell had happened and could I please just talk to them. I silenced my phone and started putting groceries away with mechanical precision, trying to focus on simple tasks while my mind spun through everything that had just happened. The lasagna ingredients went in the fridge. The wine went on the counter. The tiramisu supplies arranged themselves next to the stove. And with each item put in its proper place, I felt my resolve strengthen. This was my kitchen. My house. My life. And I just defended it in a way I'd never managed before. Ethan arrived at 6 as planned, holding a bottle of wine and a wrapped present, his face open and warm until he saw my expression. "What happened?" he asked immediately, setting everything down to pull me into a hug. I told him. All of it. The surprise announcement, the suitcases, the assumption that my space was theirs to claim. The argument and the tears and the guilt trips and finally getting them to leave. And then I told him what I was planning to do, the decision I'd made somewhere in the middle of putting away groceries. I'm changing all the locks tonight. Right now. Before they can come back and let themselves in again. He didn't question it or suggest I was overreacting or try to convince me to sleep on it. He just asked if I wanted company at the hardware store and help installing the new locks. We drove to the big box store on Lyndale, the one that stayed open late on Christmas Eve for last-minute shoppers desperate for forgotten ingredients or emergency supplies. The lock aisle was nearly empty, fluorescent lights humming overhead while I selected new deadbolts and doorknob sets and anything else I'd need to completely secure my home against unwanted entry. The cashier, a young guy who looked like he'd drawn the short straw for holiday shifts, rang up my purchases without comment. He probably saw stranger things than someone buying locks on Christmas Eve. Ethan loaded everything into his truck while I sat in the passenger seat, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what I'd just done. I'd chosen my boundaries over my parents' feelings. I'd prioritized my peace over their expectations. And now I was literally locking them out, making it impossible for them to override my decisions with the keys I'd given them in good faith years ago. Back at my house, Ethan spread the new lock sets across my kitchen table and pulled up installation videos on his phone. He was handy in that way architects often are, comfortable with tools and spatial problems. I watched him work on the front door first, removing the old deadbolt with steady efficiency, talking me through each step so I'd know how to maintain the new locks. "This is good," he said at one point, not looking up from his work. "I know it feels extreme, but you're protecting something you built. That's not wrong." My phone continued its persistent buzzing. More texts from my mother, now verging into territory that made my therapist's warnings about emotional manipulation feel prophetic. "You've always been difficult. Ever since you were a child, you've fought against everyone trying to help you. Maybe that's why you're still alone at your age. Maybe that's why you can't maintain relationships." The cruelty was meant to hurt enough that I'd apologize, back down, let them return. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before. Tyler called while Ethan was working on the back door. I answered because my brother deserved an explanation that wasn't filtered through our parents' perspective. He listened while I laid out what had happened, his silence on the other end of the line stretching long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful. "They didn't ask first. They just showed up with suitcases and announced they were moving in?" "That's exactly what happened," I confirmed. "And when I said no, they acted like I was the unreasonable one for not wanting them to take over my house and my life." He was quiet again, processing. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I moved to Denver for a reason, Jess. I love them, but I couldn't breathe with them 20 minutes away. You've been dealing with this way longer than I ever did. I don't blame you for changing the locks. Tell Mom I called you, that I think you're doing what you need to do. It won't help, but at least she'll know not everyone thinks you're the villain here." We talked for a few more minutes, Tyler sharing stories of his own boundary-setting journey with our parents, the fights and guilt trips and eventual détente that came from physical distance. He'd built a relationship with them that worked because it happened on his terms. During scheduled visits he could control and end when necessary. I was trying to do the same thing while living in the same city, and it was infinitely harder. By 10 o'clock, every lock in my house had been changed. Front door, back door, the side entrance from the garage. Ethan had even changed the lock on my bedroom door, a detail I hadn't thought of but appreciated. The old lock sat in a pile on my kitchen counter, brass and silver mechanisms that had guarded my home for 3 years. The new ones were shiny and modern, unprogrammed by anyone's muscle memory. My parents' keys would no longer work. They could show up at my door, but they couldn't let themselves in. The power dynamic had shifted. We made the lasagna together, Ethan layering noodles and ricotta while I prepared the sauce from scratch, using my grandmother's recipe. My father's mother, actually, a woman who died when I was 12 but who I remembered as warm and accepting in ways my parents had never been. She'd once told me that the secret to good sauce was patience, that you couldn't rush the flavors into coming together. They needed time and heat and the right conditions. I thought about that while I stirred, wooden spoon moving in steady circles, the kitchen filling with the smell of garlic and tomatoes and herbs. Around 11, my mother tried calling. I didn't answer. She tried again at 11:15. Then my father called. Then my mother again. The phone buzzed with such persistence that eventually Ethan picked it up and silenced it completely, setting it face down on the far counter where I couldn't see the notifications piling up. They'll wear themselves out eventually, he said. And tomorrow, when they've calmed down, you can decide how and when you want to communicate with them. But tonight, you deserve peace. We ate lasagna at midnight, sitting at my small kitchen table with candles lit because it was technically Christmas now and something about the moment felt worth marking. The food was good. The wine was better. And the silence, broken only by our conversation and the occasional creak of my old house settling, was the most precious gift I could have given myself. No demands. No criticism. No performance required. Just me and someone who saw me clearly and liked what he saw. After dinner, I finally looked at my phone. 63 texts. 14 missed calls. 2 voicemails I deleted without listening to because I knew what they'd say. My mother's final text, sent at 11:47, read simply, "We're outside. Let us in. We need to talk about this." My stomach dropped. I walked to the front window and peered through the curtains. Their car was indeed parked at the curb, headlights off but shapes visible in the front seats. They'd been sitting there, waiting, probably expecting me to relent and open the door. Ethan came to stand beside me at the window, his hand finding mine in the darkness of my living room. "They've been out there this whole time," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to myself. "Sitting in their car in the cold on Christmas Eve because they can't accept that I said no. Do you want me to go talk to them?" He offered, but I shook my head. That would just give them ammunition. Evidence that some man is controlling me, turning me against them. They already think that's what's happening. We watched for another minute as my mother's silhouette in the passenger seat gestured animatedly, probably arguing with my father about strategy. Then I closed the curtains, returned to the kitchen, and sent a single text to both of them. "I'm not opening the door tonight or any night until you can respect that this is my home and I get to decide who enters it. Go back to your house. We can talk after the holidays when everyone has calmed down." I didn't wait to see their response. I turned off my phone completely, the screen going dark with a finality that felt both terrifying and liberating. They stayed for another 20 minutes. I know because Ethan kept checking through a gap in the curtains, reporting their presence like a lookout on a ship watching for storms. Finally, the headlights came on and the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing down the street toward Edina and the house they'd refused to stay in. I won't lie and say I felt victorious. Mostly I felt exhausted and sad and relieved in equal measures. But underneath all of that was something solid and unshakable. I'd held my boundary. I'd protected my space. And I hadn't broken when they applied every pressure point they'd developed over 3 decades. Ethan stayed the night, not because of anything romantic but because the idea of being alone after all of that felt impossible. We watched old movies on my couch, his arm around my shoulders, both of us occasionally dozing off until weird dialogue woke us up again. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, in that strange liminal space between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, he asked me what I was going to do next. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just know I can't go back to how things were. Where they drop by whenever they want and I'm expected to rearrange my life around their needs. I can't live like that anymore." "You shouldn't have to," he said simply. "The fact that they're your parents doesn't give them ownership over you." Christmas morning arrived gray and quiet, snow falling in those fat lazy flakes that make Minneapolis look like a snow globe. I made coffee while Ethan started a fire in my small fireplace, and we opened the modest presents we'd gotten each other. He gave me a first edition of a design book I'd been wanting, something he must have hunted for weeks to find. I gave him a custom leather portfolio I'd made myself, embossed with his initials. Small gifts, but chosen with care, and somehow that mattered more than anything expensive or elaborate could have. My phone stayed off all morning. I knew the moment I turned it on, the messages would flood in, and I wasn't ready to face that deluge yet. Instead, we made breakfast, fancy French toast with berries and real maple syrup, and ate it while watching the snow accumulate in my backyard. Mrs. O'Neill, my elderly neighbor, waved from her kitchen window and I waved back, two people spending a quiet holiday in their own spaces, and there was something peaceful about that. Not lonely, despite what my mother would claim, but peacefully solitary in the way that recharges rather than depletes. Around noon, Ethan left to visit his own family, a casual gathering at his sister's place in St. Paul. He invited me along but understood when I declined. I needed time alone in my house, time to sit with what I'd done and feel my way through all the complicated emotions that came with it. After he left, I finally turned on my phone. The screen lit up with notifications that seemed to scroll forever. I scanned through them with a kind of detached curiosity, watching my parents' emotional journey play out in text form. Anger first. Multiple messages about disrespect and ingratitude. Then hurt, long paragraphs about how much they'd sacrificed and how little I appreciated it. Then bargaining, suggestions that we could compromise, that maybe they could stay just a few days, that surely I could see reason. Then more anger, sharper this time, accusations about Ethan and my selfishness and how I'd changed from the sweet daughter they'd raised. And finally, in the early morning hours, a kind of cold formality from my father. We'll give you space to reconsider your behavior. When you're ready to discuss this like an adult, you know how to reach us. The progression would have been textbook if it weren't so painful. I'd learned about these patterns in therapy, the way controlling people respond when their control is challenged. But knowing the theory didn't make living through it easier. These weren't abstract abusers in a case study. They were my parents, people who genuinely believed they were acting out of love, who couldn't see how their version of love required my complete submission to their will. I spent Christmas afternoon doing something I'd never done before. I wrote them a letter. Not a text or an email, but an actual letter in my own handwriting on good paper. I needed to say things I couldn't say in person, things that would get interrupted or dismissed or turned back on me in the circular arguments they specialized in. The letter took 3 drafts and most of the afternoon, but eventually I had something that felt true. I wrote about growing up under their management, how every choice had been filtered through their approval. I wrote about the opportunities they claimed to have given me, acknowledging that yes, they provided material comfort, but also pointing out that they'd withheld something more essential. The freedom to become myself. I wrote about Chris, the musician I'd broken up with to please them, and how that decision had taught me that their love came with conditions I couldn't keep meeting. I wrote about the years of therapy, the slow painful work of learning that boundaries weren't betrayal and that I had the right to a life that looked different from what they'd envisioned. I wrote about the house they'd tried to move into without permission, how I'd worked and saved and renovated it into exactly what I needed. How every room represented a choice I'd made, a piece of myself I'd reclaimed. And how their attempt to simply take that over, to reshape it for their needs without considering mine, was the culmination of a lifetime of them seeing me as an extension of themselves rather than a separate person with separate needs. The hardest part to write was the ending. I love you both, I wrote, and I mean that. But I can't have a relationship with you where my boundaries are constantly violated and my choices are constantly questioned. I need you to respect that I'm an adult with the right to make my own decisions, even decisions you disagree with. I need you to understand that showing up uninvited, letting yourselves into my home without permission, and trying to move in without asking first was not okay. It will never be okay. If we're going to have any relationship going forward, it has to be based on mutual respect. That means accepting that I get to decide who enters my home and my life. It means trusting that I'm capable of managing my own affairs. It means loving me as I am, not as you wish I would be. I sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it in careful script, and set it by the door to mail after the holiday. Then I did something else I'd never done. I called Mia and asked if she wanted company. She arrived an hour later with a bottle of wine and leftover Christmas ham from her family dinner, and we spent the evening on my couch talking through everything that had happened. She'd witnessed years of my struggles with my parents, had been the friend who'd first suggested therapy, who'd celebrated every boundary I'd managed to set. "This is huge, Jess," she said at one point, refilling our wine glasses. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now because you're in the middle of the storm, but you just did something incredibly brave. You protected yourself. You chose yourself. That's enormous." "It doesn't feel brave," I admitted. "It feels terrifying and sad and like I've broken something that can't be fixed." "Maybe it can't be fixed," she said gently. "Maybe it was already broken and you're just finally admitting it. But broken doesn't mean ended. It means transformed. And maybe what comes next will actually be healthier, even if it's harder at first." The days between Christmas and New Year's were strange. My parents maintained radio silence after I mailed the letter, which arrived on the 27th according to the tracking. I'd expected an immediate response, another barrage of texts or an angry phone call, but instead there was nothing. The silence was somehow worse than the anger had been, filled with implication and weight. Tyler called to check on me, reporting that our parents were hurt and confused and insisting they'd done nothing wrong. "Mom keeps saying she was just trying to be helpful," he told me. "That you misunderstood their intentions. That you've become someone they don't recognize." "Maybe I have," I said. "Maybe that's the whole point. They don't recognize me because they never really knew me. They knew the version of me I performed to keep the peace, but that's not who I actually am." Tyler was quiet for a moment, then admitted something I hadn't expected. "Sarah and I have been talking about this. About how we want to handle boundaries with them when we get married, when we have kids eventually. Watching what you're going through, it's making us realize we need to be really clear about expectations now, before things get complicated. I'm sorry you're the one dealing with this, Jess, but in a weird way, you're showing me what standing up to them looks like." Work helped distract me during the week. Lauren and I had deadlines for January launches, and losing myself in design problems felt like a relief. Color palettes and typography decisions were concrete in a way family dynamics weren't. I could control the outcome, make something beautiful through skill and effort. The brewery logo I'd been working on came together perfectly, the client loved it, and that small professional victory felt like proof that my life wasn't falling apart even if my family relationships were. Ethan came over most evenings, sometimes with takeout, sometimes cooking dinner with me, always present but never pushy. He understood instinctively when I needed to talk through my feelings and when I needed to think about anything else. We planned a New Year's trip to his family's cabin up north, just the two of us, 3 days of silence and snow and distance from the situation I couldn't resolve. On New Year's Eve morning, I woke to a text from my mother. It was the first direct communication in 6 days. "Your father and I would like to meet with you. Somewhere neutral. We've been thinking about your letter and we want to talk. Just talk. Please." The please at the end nearly broke me. My mother didn't say please often. It wasn't her style. But I'd learned enough in therapy to recognize that the impulse to immediately cave to that small word was exactly the conditioning I was trying to unlearn. I sat with the text for an hour, drinking coffee and watching the morning light change across my kitchen, before responding. "I'm willing to meet in January. After the holidays. I'll let you know when I'm ready." The response came quickly. "We're your parents. We shouldn't have to make appointments to see you. This is exactly the problem." And my reply was just as quick. "Yes, it is exactly the problem. You think being my parents means you don't have to respect my boundaries. We'll talk when I'm ready." I turned off my phone again and started packing for the cabin trip, shoving warm clothes and books into a duffel bag with more force than necessary. Ethan picked me up at noon, his truck loaded with groceries and firewood, and we drove north out of the city into the white quiet of rural Minnesota. The cabin was small and simple, no Wi-Fi or cell service, just a wood stove and propane heat and windows that looked out on frozen lake and pine trees heavy with snow. We spent 3 days at the cabin existing in a simpler rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and reading by the fire. Afternoons for walks on the frozen lake, our boots crunching through the top layer of snow. Evenings for cooking elaborate meals and playing cards and talking about everything except my parents. On New Year's Eve, we toasted with cheap champagne at midnight, standing on the cabin's small porch watching distant fireworks from some resort light up the sky, and I felt something settle in my chest. A certainty that whatever happened next, I'd be okay. I'd chosen myself once. I could keep choosing myself. We drove back to Minneapolis on January 2nd, returning to reality and cell service and the weight of unresolved family drama. My phone came alive with messages the moment we hit the highway, but most of them were work-related or friends checking in. Nothing new from my parents, which felt significant. They were waiting for me to make the next move, probably hoping the silence would pressure me into reaching out first, apologizing, backing down. It was a strategy that had worked for 32 years. I wasn't going to let it work anymore. On January 5th, I texted them suggesting we meet at a coffee shop in Uptown, neutral territory halfway between our neighborhoods. I proposed the following Saturday at 10 in the morning, a time that felt formal and bounded, not the casual dropping by they preferred. My mother responded within minutes. "We can meet at our house. More comfortable." "No," I replied. "The coffee shop or we don't meet at all." There was a long pause, then my father's response. "Fine. The coffee shop. Saturday at 10. I spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing with Dr. Stevens. We role-played conversations, anticipated their arguments, reinforced my boundaries until I could state them clearly without wavering. She reminded me that I couldn't control their response, only my own actions. That reconciliation required them to genuinely change their behavior, not just promise to try harder while continuing the same patterns. And that if they couldn't meet me where I was, if they couldn't respect the boundaries I needed, then reducing contact or even stepping back from the relationship entirely was a valid choice. Saturday arrived cold and bright, one of those January days where the sun on snow is almost blinding. I arrived at the Copper Hen 10 minutes early, ordered my usual latte, and claimed a corner table with good sightlines and easy exit access. Ethan had offered to come for moral support, but this felt like something I needed to do alone. My parents arrived exactly at 10, both of them looking older somehow, more fragile than I remembered. My mother's face was tight with tension. My father's shoulders carried a weariness I'd never noticed before. We exchanged stiff greetings and they ordered coffee, the mundane ritual of cream and sugar providing a buffer before we had to talk. Finally, we sat, 3 people around a small table, an entire lifetime of complicated dynamics hovering in the space between us. "Your father and I have been discussing your letter," my mother began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth. "We want you to understand that everything we've done has been out of love." "I know you believe that," I said carefully. "But love doesn't give you the right to ignore my boundaries or make decisions about my life without my input. Showing up with suitcases and announcing you were moving in wasn't love. It was control." "We were trying to help," my father said, his voice defensive. "You're all alone in that house. We thought you'd appreciate the company, the support." "I'm not alone," I corrected. "And even if I were, that would be my choice to make. You can't just decide what's best for me and implement it without asking." The conversation that followed was difficult and circular in places, old patterns trying to reassert themselves. My mother cried. My father got stern. They listed grievances and implied I was being influenced by Ethan or my therapist or anyone except my own clear thinking. But this time, I didn't engage with the circular arguments. I stayed focused on the specific issue. They'd violated my boundaries. They'd tried to move into my home without permission. That wasn't acceptable, and it wouldn't be acceptable in the future. After an hour of talking around each other, I finally said what I'd come to say. "I love you both, but I can't have a relationship with you that requires me to have no boundaries. If you want to be part of my life, you need to respect that I'm an adult who gets to make my own choices. That means no dropping by unannounced. No letting yourselves into my house without permission. No making plans that involve me without asking first. And it means accepting that my life might look different from what you wanted, but it's still mine to live. My mother looked at my father, some silent communication passing between them. Then she turned back to me, her expression carefully composed. So you're saying we need permission to see our own daughter? That's not what I said, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'm saying you need to respect my space and my time. Call before you visit. Ask before you make plans. Treat me like an independent adult instead of a project you're managing. The silence that followed was heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, my father spoke, his voice gruff. We can try. That's all we're asking for. But Jessica, you need to understand this is hard for us. Watching you pull away, shut us out. We're your parents. We'll always worry. You can worry without trying to control, I said gently. You can love me without requiring that I live the life you planned for me. That's what I'm asking for. Not distance, but respect. We left the coffee shop without resolution but with something that might become understanding given time. They didn't apologize, not really, but they agreed to call before visiting, to respect my space, to try. It wasn't everything I needed, but it was a start. Over the following weeks, we began building something new, a relationship with actual boundaries that sometimes felt awkward but mostly felt healthier. They called before coming over. They asked about my life instead of telling me how to fix it. They met Ethan and were stiff but polite, which was progress. My mother still sometimes slipped into old patterns, suggesting I'd be happier if I did things her way, but now I could name it and redirect without the conversation becoming explosive. My father still occasionally treated me like I needed guidance, but he listened when I reminded him I had things handled. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Honest instead of performative. Built on respect instead of control. Standing in my kitchen one evening in late January, cooking dinner in the house I defended, I thought about that Christmas Eve when everything had changed. The night I'd changed the locks and chosen myself over their expectations. It had felt dramatic in the moment, maybe even extreme. But it had been necessary. Sometimes love requires walls before it can require doors. Sometimes you have to lock people out before you can safely let them back in on new terms. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. A photo of a recipe she thought I'd like, sent without commentary or expectation. I smiled and sent back a thank you, a small exchange that would have been impossible a month ago. We were learning each other slowly, carefully, building trust through consistent small interactions rather than grand gestures. It would take time. Maybe years. But for the first time in my life, I believed we might eventually have a relationship that didn't require me to disappear. The locks on my doors stayed changed. A reminder that boundaries weren't cruelty but self-preservation. That choosing yourself wasn't selfish but necessary. And that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for a broken relationship was insist it transform or end, because settling for dysfunction helped no one. My parents had raised me, but I'd raised myself into someone capable of standing firm. And that, more than anything they'd tried to give me, was the gift that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.